the feel of the conference. It's very different from the conferences that I've been to in the past, at least in London. It feels it's much more open and performative, and of course we just had a fantastic performance just now, so I'm not sure how I'm going to follow that, but I will endeavor to open up a few questions about curating in the time of globalization. So this conference today, we're talking about the arts and globalization. And the curator, I think, in many ways has become the linchpin of this system of globalization. There are curators everywhere, and everyone apparently is a curator, right? So you can curate music, you can curate cheese, you can curate whatever, right? Curating is now completely ubiquitous everywhere. But what is the role of the curator? What kinds of strategies can the curator deploy to translate and critically address the crucial challenges of globalization in the art world? Now, I want to address this today by highlighting three strands of my research and practice as a curator in both independent and inside the museum and also outside the museum. Now, I'll address this in three areas. Firstly, the first part looks at the context of the global museum. In my case, as Neil said, when I was a curator at Tate Britain. The second one talks about what I think is the increasing importance of thinking from the Caribbean thinking, to critical curatorial practice, right? And in the third part, I'll present some speculations, and they are speculations, based on a research project that I've been involved in around what I want to call post-contemporary approaches to curating. And I hope we can have a discussion about some of these things. So I guess for part one of this presentation, I want to focus on the emergence of the so-called global museum and its relationship to critical curatorial practices. Today, there are over 55,000 museums in over 200 countries around the world, right? So we've seen a massive explosion of museums. The vast majority of this new phase of museum building work is taking place in the Middle East and across Asia. And the last decade or so has seen many museums of modern art in the West, in Europe and North America, attempting to play catch-up, really, to this huge onrush of this global phenomenon of museums. So, for example, MoMA in New York and Tate recently built an extension, and Tate, of course, are developing a huge extension, a pyramid, effectively, at the back of the museum. Now, this increased awareness of the global has come from, I think, several sources. The rise of the global art market, and obviously large-scale exhibitions and international art fairs. The the massive circulation of artists internationally. Artists are traveling now much more than ever before. The expanded awareness of so-called cultural diversity for audiences, I think it was mentioned, and for museums of modern art. And also, I think that allied to that, this increasing cultural diversity, there's a kind of sense that which there is a need to develop new audiences and to encourage social cohesion through art. Just to name a few things. And of course, Niels has been involved in many initiatives in Denmark around art and interculture. So there are both international and domestic pressures on museums to become more relevant and to embrace the contemporary by engaging with notions of the global and cultural diversity, right? But I think an acute problem arises that we need to address. What does it mean for a national museum of modern art to embrace the global and cultural diversity when the collections of these museums, right, are largely rooted in European and North American artworks with its associated Eurocentric art historical and curatorial themes and imperatives? What kinds of specific challenges does embracing the global pose to the National Art Museum charged with the collection and care of works of art on behalf of the nation? And what kinds of aesthetic judgments and criteria that can be made to accommodate both Western and non-Western art in the same gallery on equal terms, right? These are some of the challenges that I think we face. Now, this incredible international museum expansion runs in parallel with attempts by many museums to present works by non-Western artists in Western citadels, often in the form of large-scale group exhibitions, right? Some regions of the globe have been prioritized over others, reflecting on their importance in the global art market. And the result have been a series of international blockbuster shows that have purported to survey, in some cases, the art of an entire region, right, or an entire continent in one exhibition. A few examples are Indian Highway at Serpentine Gallery, um, China Power Station. That, that can't be right, 5 minutes. Okay. Paris, Bombay, Delhi at the Pompidou Africa Remix are a few examples of these kind of exhibitions. And this reductionist and embracing of the global has gone, I think, side by side with the historical neglect of the increasingly global context of the changing nature of Western cities, right? Outside the walls of these museums caused by international migration and globalization itself. The growing cultural diversity of Western cities and societies and its relationship to art production has often, I think, been misrecognized and relegated or underrepresented and under-resourced to the underrepresented and under-resourced margins of what's called cultural diversity policy and multiculturalism. And I think this state-led, top-down multiculturalism has been adopted by many museums as a form of bureaucratic cultural managerialism, seen as a way of, in a way, of a necessary way of managing and controlling difficult questions of race and colonialism and cultural difference. Now, these issues around what I want to call domestic internationalism have traditionally been seen as marginal to the curatorial and knowledge production nexus in the heart of museums in the West. By and large, with a few exceptions, many Western museums, in my opinion, have misrecognized or ignored the growing domestic context, the domestic international context, and rich migration cultures outside the very doors of their institutions, right? In their rush to embrace the financially more luring global out there. So they've ignored, I think, the rich migration context in their own cities. And this, I think, has enabled them to often elide difficult questions about colonialism, about the history of their collections, and the issues of power and production of knowledge that result from that. As a result, many museums, from my kind of reading, have become increasingly enthralled to an empty, market-led internationalism, which often ignores this rich domestic context. So, faced with these immense challenges in curatorial practices that I've been arguing for some time now, about the need to reprogram or to refigure the so-called global museum. I'm interested in a more critical and institutionally self-aware form of curatorial practice and reflection, particularly in relation to opening up the global, as I've just been describing. So to this end, I'd like to modestly share with you some of my own curatorial mantras based on some of the practices that I've been involved in, garnered from the wisdom of great people that have come before me. And I'd like to call these Confessions of a Recalcitrant Curator. And I truly believe that these words of wisdom from these greats can in many ways form the basis of a survival guide to anyone who's trying to reprogram the Global Museum in the way that I've tried to do. The first one is Stuart Hall, ambivalent mainstreaming. Stuart Hall he died last year, sadly. He was a Jamaican cultural theorist who was based in the UK, and he was one of the founding fathers of cultural studies. He said in a talk, when you go through the door of ambivalent mainstreaming, it's dangerous territory. It's an incredibly tricky territory, and all sorts of monsters are waiting there on the other side to assimilate you up. Now, Stuart Hall was speaking, really, about the historic moment that had been reached in Britain in the 1990s, when the post-colonial generation of mostly British-born black and Asian artists and curators who were entering the mainstream in larger numbers for the first time, after being excluded for many years, were coming into the mainstream. Now, from my experience of working at an institution like Tate Britain, I can wholeheartedly confirm that there are indeed all kinds of monsters waiting to assimilate you up when you enter a big museum. One of the biggest monsters, in my opinion, is diversity. In some ways, it's the first monster waiting for you because it's the first port of call for many black artists and curators in mainstream or non-Western artists and curators in mainstream arts organizations. And it is the assumed paradigm in which you are expected to make art or to curate. Now, I don't want to throw the baby out the bathwater, but even though diversity was the main remit that in some ways brought me into the museum, I spent 4 years really trying to deconstruct it, or at least open it up to a more rigorous intellectual agenda, based around critical issues to do with the impact of globalization, migration, and race on British art. Issues which I don't think the institution always understood or appreciated at the time, but I pursued it nonetheless. This is part of what I think Stuart Hall means by ambivalent mainstreaming, right? The ability to speak different languages at the same time to different audiences. Now, I believe this ability to switch codes and translate visual languages will be increasingly important in order to dismantle or challenge the established hierarchies of power and colonial taste as a hangover in the museum. And new audiences engaging with art in a variety of bewildering technological channels are demanding new transcultural ways of viewing and spectatorship. And hence, I think they will challenge any notion of a monocultural or inflexible curatorial culture. The second one is by Goodwin, curator, director of the Haus der Kunst in Munich, and also the director of the Venice Biennial at the moment. And he said in a work called Curating Subjects, I've always tried to work outside the canon and do it within culture. That's not to say that the canon is bad, but the canon has a highly circumscribed notion of what artistic practice could be. To curate within culture is to take a space of culture in the present as an open place of working. That means that you have to have greater mobility in terms of bringing procedures of making art that may not have a place in the broader context of contemporary art. So in other words, it doesn't mean giving up on the canon, but finding a way to rejig it. And I think this quote, in some ways, articulates the problematic of many of us who are working within mainstream institutions. We're working both with and against the exclusions of the canon. Kind of like trying to face two ways at once, right? Rejigging the canon, or even trying to construct new canons or new archives. Of course, there is life outside the canon. That's the most important point. And many of us are doing this work of curating in culture and engaging in political struggles and working through the politics of resistance and trying to reconcile art and life. Even when I was in the institution, I always maintained independent projects that were completely unrelated to canonical questions of art history, right? Now, these kind of external projects and exhibitions they engaged what Okwi calls the space of culture outside the museum, right? The challenge is, how do we bring this space of culture and conflict into the museum in order to challenge these underlying assumptions on which much programming rests? So we need to engage what's happening outside the museum, really, where culture and conflict take place, and bring that into the space of the museum and see what happens. Third one is the Italian author of the Futurist Manifesto, Marinetti, argued that museums and their collections are like cemeteries, cities of the dead, right? Once an artwork enters into a museum collection, they go into a death-like torpor. They gather dust in cold storage and are rarely seen again. Right? This is exactly what the artist and writer Rashid Arain told me. This is the work of Rashid Arain. When I first started to work at Tate, he told me, go straight to the holding stores, right, and look at my work sitting there in cold storage, gathering dust. And he was right. I saw his work with my own eyes, stacked up in beautifully ordered crates, right, not to be seen on the display yet. Actually, what's happened is since then, in the last few years, his work has actually been displayed on several occasions. Now, this, of course, has been the story of so many artists of all backgrounds, not just black or non-Western artists, right? But it particularly relates to this experience, I think, of non-Western and non-white artists. This concrete experience in the Tate stores, seeing the work of so many artists that I admired just sitting there and collecting dust, a city of the dead, as the futurist claims, really has inspired much of my curatorial and programming work in the museum. And I was determined to speak about the context of this work, to get this work out of the crates and into the gallery. My job, in a way, was to create the right conditions and the narratives to contextualize and present this work, and to show how works by artists such as Rashid Areen are in fact central to the stories of British art and modernism that we need to narrate in the 21st century Global Museum. Now, I'd just like to quickly go through a few images of projects that I was involved in curating at Tate Britain, which I think in some ways can maybe point towards institutionally self-reflexive exhibition practice that can open up new dialogue. This is one project during the Chris Ofili retrospective at Tate Britain in 2010. I organised the showing of Chris Ofili's work, The Union Black, which is a kind of black nationalist version of the British flag, the Union flag. And it was flown on Tate Britain's mast for the first time, actually. In its 200-year history, they'd only ever shown the Union Jack, right? So for this exhibition, we basically put the Union Black up there. This was the reaction of some of our friends from the English Defence League who were protesting outside Tate Britain at the time when they saw some of this thing. And this is the kind of space of conflict and culture that, I think we need to bring into the museum. This is just a project that I did with an artist called Faisal Abduella, which is in the huge Devine Gallery in Tate Britain. He's an artist, but he's also a barber in an urban context in North London, and he cuts hair. So we brought him in, talk about his work, and cut audiences' hair live during the gallery. This is an exhibition called Thin Black Lines, which was an exhibition for the first time about the contribution of black women, black and Asian women artists in Britain. These are some works from Chitapa Biswas, Sonia Boyce, who is a colleague of mine at University of the Arts now, Lubana Hamid, Maud Salter. These works had not been seen within Tate Britain before. This is an installation shot. And then Migrations was an exhibition that I co-curated, which looked at really the Tate collection and how the Tate collection had been influenced by issues around migration. So works by people like Sibrix, these are all foreign artists in a way. But we also, Shenza from India, but we also looked at British artists that were born in Britain, not migrants, but who felt themselves to be, if you like, fighting against the politics of race and exclusion. Keith Piper, Donald Rodney, Mona Hatoum as well, was part of this show. Sonia Boyce. I'm just going to go through this really quickly. This was a shot from one of the rooms. Now, I'd like to, in a way, I'm just saying that I think these kinds of practices, I think, can kind of point toward the kind of institutionally self-aware exhibition practices that I think can open up a new debate. So, second point I want to make is about the influence of Caribbean thought and critical curatorial practice. And I've been really thinking for a long time now about what I'd want to call a Caribbean form of modernity, the way that certain writers and artists have written about the Caribbean. This Caribbean mode of thinking and writing and being in the world, expressed by such literary giants as Edouard Glissant, Stuart Hall, who I've mentioned, Frantz Fanon, Wilson Harris, etc., has tended to gravitate around such seminal concepts as creolization, hybridity, diaspora, cross-culturality. And I think I've reflected a common concern by these writers with the poetics and politics of the history of the transatlantic slave trade, of migrations and movements of people, of notions of cultural mixing and syncretism, and especially in its literary guise, a common engagement with the beguiling and mysteriously beautiful landscape of the Caribbean islands. These writers, in a way, have created a Caribbean critical imaginary that configures these islands as a unique laboratory of universal human and cultural experience. In a way, a kind of huge historical experiment or instruction manual in how human beings can survive, eke out, and get by on a common living experience for a traumatic but nevertheless highly productive process of cultural bricolage, assemblage and negotiations across and between cultures, a process where art and course and aesthetics play a really important role. Caribbean modes of thinking about modernity are becoming increasingly essential to curatorial narratives in contemporary art. In this regard, I think the work of Martinican writer and philosopher Edouard Glissant is paramount. I've spoken and written at length in other contexts about Glissant's impact on contemporary art and curating. But what I want to focus on here today is Glissant's theory of the right to opacity, and how this, I think, can open up a new perspective on the role of the curator in an age of globalization. In several of his texts and interviews, Glissant talks about the rights of people and things not to be understood, to resist full scrutiny by the other. The demand for opacity is not a demand for invisibility, but an insistence that I exist on other than your terms, right? It's an assertion of the right not to be understood. Glissant was referring to the dominant demand for transparency that he saw as characteristic of Western thought and its relations to the non-West. In an interview with Mantia Diawara in 2009, he said, the quote, "There's a basic injustice in the worldwide spread of transparency and the projection of Western thought, right? Why must we evaluate people on the scale of ideas proposed by the West? As far as I'm concerned, a person has a right to be opaque. That doesn't stop me liking that person. It doesn't stop me from working with him or hanging out with him. A racist is someone who refuses what he doesn't understand. I accept what I don't understand, right?" So I think Glissant's theory has been taken up by a number of artists and curators in recent years to defend the right of the artist and the artwork to opacity, to resist complete understanding and imposition and the imposition of external meanings, right? For me, one of the implications of opacity in art would mean that as curators working with artists who have been raced or othered within the Western canon, sometimes we need to uncurate, right? In other words, to create a space in our writing and curatorial practice for the work itself as a starting point before engaging any form of curatorial interpretation or narrative, right? So this is, I think, a really simple, but I think quite important point. Sometimes it may mean that as curators, we've got to take a step back a little bit, indulge in less curatorial discourse and posturing, and focus more on allowing the work to breathe, to speak for itself on its own terms. And what I'm arguing here is that a measure of opacity can sometimes be useful in thinking about how curators can respond ethically in relation to artists and artworks through uncurating, right? A great example of this, I think, of this approach to curating, in my opinion, was Caroline Christoph Bakargiev's Documenta 13 in Kassel in 2012. And this ambitious exhibition challenged traditional notions of what art could be understood as by highlighting objects, ideas, cultural forms, forms of natural life, which have traditionally been excluded or misunderstood or not accepted as legitimate forms of artistic knowledge in the West, such as animal life and behavior. You can see here work by Pierre Huy, which was very important, a kind of iconic work in this exhibition. Animal forms, for example, minerals and rocks, and other non-human elements which are often opaque to human understanding, immaterial forms of knowledge. How do you reveal and disclose this to people? How do you let these forms, objects, and ideas speak for themselves? These are some of the questions that I think Christoph Bakargiev successfully dealt with in Documenta 13. Opacity in this form of curating can sometimes appear to be uncritical. Indeed, some critics argued that Christoph Bakargiev effectively surrendered her curatorial responsibility. But in my reading, the exhibition successfully shed new light on many marginal forms of knowledge, forms and ideas that are not well known or accepted as art or within the sphere of art, such as plants, for example. Inviting new modes of active spectatorship in collaboration with artists and thinkers, giving space to artistic research, to dialogue with a self-reflexive form of curatorial research. Now I want to move on quickly to my last part. I think these kinds of projects that kind of effectively uncurate or that give more space, they give more space to the process of curatorial and artistic research and forms of creative speculation than by focusing on the end product itself, right? The object, the art object. I think this can allow new meanings and dialogues about the work to emerge. So, to conclude, I'd like to briefly present 4 propositions around the notion of what I want to call post-contemporary curating, which explores the space of speculation opened up by experimental modes of curating projects such as Documented 13 that focus on models of collaboration. That's the key point. Models that are collaborative between curatorial research and artistic research. Now, these are propositions I developed in the context of a European EU-funded project at the Royal College of Art with Professor Victoria Walsh called Curatorial and Artistic Research in the Age of Migrations. The European Museums in the Age of Migrations, it was called, actually. And this project was asking the following question. What does curatorial and artistic research mean in the 21st century, age of migration and globalization, where new, mobile, performative, and immaterial art practices are challenging Western museums and their hierarchical models of curating? And I put forward 4 propositions that I will explain. They're a little bit abstract, so bear with me. I'm sure we can kind of discuss them in the thing. First, I'll just summarize. The first proposition comes from philosopher Peter Osborne's crucial observation that in contemporary neoliberal capitalist globalization, the notion of contemporaneity, or the contemporary, and by extension contemporary art, is a necessary fiction. What he means by that is that it's not possible to represent all of the world's current art in a single temporal conjunction, right? It's not possible to be everywhere at the same time. Therefore, what is seen as a contemporary is a necessary fiction. And therefore, contemporary art itself is a fictive construction. That's the key point I wanted to get about this, right? So he said, so my proposition is that post-contemporary is then a critical curatorial response to the current constellation of contemporary art, where a necessary fiction glued together by the market and a putative transnationalism best exemplified by the biennial form and international art fairs, right? In other words, what I'm saying is that contemporary art today is a fictive construction hijacked by the market, and much traditional curating merely attempts or acts to support this fictive construction. The post-contemporary, therefore, emerges as a curatorial provocation responding to and anticipating the unstable and problematic conditions of contemporary art. Second proposition. There are resistances to the presentism, in other words, the way in which the contemporary presents itself as the only thing that determines the present, right? There are resistances to the presentism of globalized contemporary art and the closing of horizons for alternative futures beyond the dictates of the market, and the facile congealing of contemporary art into an ersatz historical style. And these are forms of art practice and curatorial practice that fall outside of the bubble of contemporary art and don't really fit within the purview of the operations of the fiction of the market and the bubble of contemporary art as currently constituted and supported by dominant institutions in the art market and galleries and museums. In other words, galleries, museums are part of a circle, really, that are promoting particular kinds of artworks based on Western, Eurocentric, modernist notions of the art object, right? And there are new practices, new forms of art making, performative, we've just seen today, performative, immaterial forms of practice that are not represented within, that stand outside of this notion of the contemporary. So the recent focus on the documentary models, on educational models, on engaged social collaborations have attempted to establish and describe new relationships that operate outside and in opposition to the boundaries of the contemporary. So radical performance, artistic collectives, socially engaged work, for example. And post-contemporary curating, therefore, attempts to engage with and provide a platform for these tendencies in current art practices and curatorial terms. What I'm saying that, therefore, is that a form of post-contemporary curating starts to engage, move away in a way from these object-based practices in the contemporary and starts to give a platform to support new emerging modes of art making. Third, and I'll just point to the top one, the top one. I think what this means, in a way, is that in the post-contemporary imagination, the divide between the artist and the curator breaks down, right? It becomes blurred. And the distinction between the artist-curator really is rendered redundant. Why? Because the kinds of work that is being produced now it really involves collaborative processes. Often curators are working in collaboration and with artists in the research, right? Finally, post-contemporary, therefore, is curatorial and artistic work that critiques and exposes the complicity of art with the market and the fiction of the contemporary. In other words, post-contemporary art and curating researches and challenges the basis of the conditions of the emergence of contemporaneity itself. In other words, we have, as curators and artists, we have to be self-reflexive and aware of our relationship to this fictive contemporaneity, if that makes sense, right? So, post-contemporary is a form of curatorial self-reflexivity in understanding the role of curating and artistic research in contemporary practice. In other words, just to finish, we need a form, what I'm saying is that we need a form of curating that is critically self-aware and encourages alternative forms of collaborative practice. Thank you for listening.
Thanks a lot, Paul, for this tour de force through your slides and your experiences. I think it's very interesting, this idea of post-contemporary, and just to open the discussion, I would like to ask you in the crowd, how does that notion that there is a conflict between the contemporary practice as we regard it and we understand it and we use it in our context, in the Scandinavian countries, for instance, or in the countries that you come from, how does that kind of rely to what Paul just talked about, that there might be a reproductiveness in the way that we actually carry out our practice, our modus operandi, and where we should be in a more self-reflective practice? Does that ring a bell? Do you kind of see yourself at one side or the other in that conflict? Or is this kind of still not really articulated in the context that you are all part of? You're more than welcome to feed in and reflect on this together with us. Any ideas or any direct questions that you would like to raise to Paul?
I know there's quite a lot there that I kind of packed in, so there may be some questions of clarification, or perhaps, or
I have a package of questions, of course. Yeah, please, we have a question down here.
If it should be some post-contemporary, it means that one day the contemporary has exist, but the fact is that the contemporary has never existed, because contemporary art has never been contemporary of anything else than the past. So actually, before to say we are post-contemporary, we recognize that contemporary exists, but contemporary art has never existed. It has been a construction, it has been a lie, it has been a construction in a way that it's like when you speak about ecological car, a car cannot be ecological.
Yes.
And contemporary art cannot be contemporary to anything else. So when you mention Marinetti and the graves and the museum with the death, and it's very true. So before to be post-contemporary, you should be contemporary. This is why we offer here the idea of ultra-contemporary. Because if the word contemporary has been stolen or misused, we need a new word to speak about the now. Mm-hmm. So to create new word is what we need now. But before to create new word, we have to kill all these lies. And actually, you mentioned documenta as a good proposition. I don't agree, because documenta was a dead project where they were artists were expressing about the Second World War when at the same time in castles they are making tanks to kill people in protesting in Saudi.
Yeah.
So actually the contemporary art shown in a documentary was 40 years old. So before to have a new definition, we need to finish with contemporary art. Why do we talk about it? It's dead. It has never existed.
Yeah. I think I'm positing post-contemporary as a kind of curatorial provocation. I'm not saying it's a historical fact or a historical epoch, right? It's being aware of what are the conditions of emergence of contemporaneity. Because often we kind of act as though contemporary art is this fact. It's out there, right? We all buy into it. We go to these biennials. We go to these art fairs. We buy art. But as I said, as Peter Osborne says, it's a necessary fiction. It's a fiction. And that in other words, that fiction is necessary because the idea of contemporaneity, or the contemporary, always has to be constructed. Because contemporaneity means different moments and periods of time coterminous with your present experience. Now, of course, that's impossible. That's literally impossible. So it has to be invented. The problem is that this invention has been increasingly co-opted by the market. That's what I'm really trying to get at. And also galleries and museums are increasingly enthralled to this, right? As they particularly search to profit from what this global art world is. So I agree with you. Contemporary has never existed. Absolutely, it's a fiction. But what we need to do now, I think, is forms of curatorial practice that make this understanding of this fiction visible. Because it's often a kind of naturalized ideology. In terms of, to take your point about Documenta 13, I disagree. For me, it was a really interesting experiment. Of course, there are contradictions at any exhibition of contemporary art that purports to do something new or radical. So, for example, at the moment in Documenta, Okwi and Redzo's exhibition focuses on Marxism and radical proposition. Throughout the exhibition, there's a reading of the whole of Marx's Capital. At the same time, of course, in Venice, you have an art world which is the complete opposite of that. Those are the contradictions, right? So, in Documenta 13, I think there was a kind of a hint at what I think is this alternative model. There were animals, there were plants, there were rocks. There's one question they asked was, can a rock think? What do you make of that? In other words, looking at different epistemologies, different systems of knowledge that are not necessarily thought of or talked about within the sphere of contemporary art. And doing that, by bringing in that opacity, right? In other words, we have to understand, opacity means that we can't understand everything. Often people tend to think of art that they want to understand this object, or the curator wants to interpret it. Well, sometimes you can't do that. And we have to live with that difference. That difference is actually a good thing. It opens up new ways, new speculative modes of thinking.
So
and
what you're actually talking about the deconstruction of the DNA of how we curate today and what we do, and the whole opening of that, bringing opacity and as kind of a center word in.
Yeah.
Is that right?
And coming out of non-Western modes of thinking from the Caribbean. I mean, my parents are Jamaican, so for me, there's a kind of personal dimension to this. But I do think that the Caribbean thinking, which is often not recognized in contemporary art, has been massively influential in many, many forms, right? And the Caribbean, because the Caribbean is where cultures collided through transatlantic slavery, through genocide of indigenous populations, right? And out of that, a new way of understanding the world has come. And I think these kinds of ideas now are what I think we should be looking at to revivify our notions of curating.
So bringing opacity and bringing a kind of deconstruct into the game is also a way of kind of dismantling the westernized, the European ownership to what we interpret as contemporary and recreating the whole setup, creating a new DNA. Is that it?
Precisely.
Yeah, okay. I think we have a question over here.
Yeah.
Hello? Is it on? I'm not sure it's relevant anymore, but I was just going to ask, how can you be self-reflective of contemporary as now? in the sense that if it's really a recent development, art in itself, or ultra art, and you try to be self-reflective of it, isn't that a little difficult? Because with time, you have the capacity to analyze or reflect on it, and therefore, I think it's an almost impossible.
Okay, what
Statement,
I
I
mean
mean-
by being self-reflexive is one, being self-reflexive of what we do as curators, right? Not naturalizing it. In other words, questioning the assumptions on which we set out our curatorial practice. Because often we present these wonderful titles of exhibitions, you know, that can explore the world and explore everything, and then we just take these artworks and fit them into this wonderful thesis. We need to take a step back from that a little bit, what I mean by uncurate, and think about what are the conditions of the emergence, actually, of this fictive thing called contemporary.
But the art itself is contemporary, and you said as well that step back is to let the artwork express what you can't express in words. So in reality, the task of the curator, by interpreting it and describing it, is it getting in the way of the artistic expression in itself, which is non-verbal.
Yeah. I mean, at the same time, having said what I've just said, we also can't go the opposite way, which is to fetishize the object and prioritize the kind of isolation of the object as being the be-all and end-all. Of course, there is a role for curatorial practice, for interpretation, because often, particularly with public institutions where you're spending public money, you do need to find a bridge to the artwork. But I do think there needs to be, the kinds of curating I'm talking about, not necessarily in places like Tate Britain or these huge organizations, but I think are existing outside of that and are really trying to open up, new ideas.
Would you say in terms of institutions, in this country there seems to be there's a conflict, some kind of dissonance between wanting to change and being able to change. So you might have curators at the curatorial level wanting to reach out to dismantle the terms that we are operating with, but at the very same time they operate in a kind of very pipeline-orientated, quite firm structures that doesn't allow them to break the system. What do you think they can do then? Would you like them to kind of be systematically disobedient, or?
Well, that's what I meant by recalcitrant. Right?
Yeah.
Recalcitrant means having a kind of disobedient attitude to authority. But what I meant, when I talked about Okwi's idea of curating inside and beyond the canyon, I think when I was at Tate Britain, I worked not only within the museum but outside the museum, right? So and tried to bring in some of those issues around urbanism, around the city, around multiculturalism, conflict into the discussion. Not necessarily through exhibitions, but through public programming, through films, which that's happening. A lot of that is happening. And I think it's being pioneered, actually, by educational departments as opposed to curatorial departments. In my experience, when I was in the curatorial department at Tate Britain, often those kinds of more conflictual issues were actually brought in by the education program and kept separate from the curatorial program.
I'd say that's exactly the same here.
Yeah, that's what we need to kind of address.
It's very interesting because they have a completely different approach.
Yeah.
And strategy
They're
is
closer to the ground.
Much closer,
Yeah.
and even in terms of perception, they're much closer to how art is actually being perceived by the audience. We have a question over here in the corner.
Yeah.
Hello, it's just a comment on this last question about the
Could you
contemporary.
speak a bit
also
louder,
guess-
please?
Sorry?
Yes, keep the microphone.
Louder, okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
Just a comment. I think also when we talk about the contemporary, thank you for your thoughts. I completely agree on this idea of the contemporary as also this construction, but I also think it's a very interesting construction to think within. But one of the problems with this idea of the contemporary is also that we think of the contemporary as a point in time, a point in linear time, where I think some of the ideas that have been around in science for at least 40 years, but also coming into cultural understandings, is to look at time from a vertical point instead of a horizontal moving point, and look down. Mi-Won Kwon, an art historian, talked about the contemporary as being all time at the same time, in the sense of maybe this situation is also a situation where we have we have the possibilities of reaching into knowledge from a lot of different, not only globally, but also historically, a lot of different perspectives. So I think this is also a way of thinking the contemporary instead of just thinking about the now, but thinking about all the things that actually go into the contemporary.
Yeah.
Historically, futurology, and now as well.
Yeah.
My question that you actually started talking about and maybe also even answered is one of the problems when we talk about curating differently and uncurating and doing things that are different than what institutions traditionally do is a question of audience, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because the discourse of the institution is such an important part of how people understand aesthetics and their aesthetic sensibilities. And of course, there's a lot of different projects that work with that situation, but very, very often, if the audience is invited into some kind of art situation, it's extremely difficult for them to see something else than a traditional work of art or understand a traditional work of art.
Yeah.
Just as a comment, I curated the exhibition down here in the corner,
Yeah.
and this idea of trying to work with a self-reflection in a very closed institutional context, but at the same time, it's difficult to look at things differently than a traditional artwork. So that's kind of not really a question; it's a comment and hit inside a question. But maybe you'd elaborate on it.
No, I agree. I agree with you. I think it is a challenge for audiences, but for me personally, I like that challenge. I think that we should challenge audiences, actually. I don't buy into the idea of presenting work or over-interpreting work and giving people, our own kind of ideas of what the work is. I like the idea of having some dialogue, of letting people speculate, of letting people... I think the great example is to think about children, Children will come in to a work of art that may be abstract or difficult, and they'll make of it what they will. They won't have any preconceptions about it. A lot of adults have preconceptions. Oh, it's too difficult. I'm not interested. A child will just come in and look at it and get engaged with it. And so in a way, I think perhaps as curators, we need to kind of embrace the spirit of childhood, to be kind of open as a way of dealing with sort of difficult artworks.
It just makes me reflect on something Umberto Maturana, the Chilean natural science and psychologist, actually said that perception is always in the mind of the viewer. But very often when we create artworks, we want to control the perception. That's even part of the curatorial practice in art museums, that we want, if not to control it, guide it as much as we possibly can, in order to make sure that the interpretation comes quite close to the one that we are actually carrying ourselves.
Yeah.
So there is that kind of contradiction and pressure
absolutely.
put into it as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I just realized that I have misbehaved, because of course you should introduce yourself. I was already thinking that we were one big family, already knowing one another, but we don't. So please, Tiana, could you say who you are and then come with your questions?
Hello, I am Tiana Miskovic. I am part of the board for this conference, and I'm also working on ultra contemporary biennial with Thierry Geoffroy, and we also are organizing the camp with tents for debate, both today and tomorrow. Well, my question and comment for you is, first of all, I'm very happy that you take this contemporaneity and question it, because that's exactly what we are doing as well in our biennial. I might not agree with the word post, because it has some linear aspects that I don't agree on, but anyhow, I think it's important, the questions you're raising. My comment is that you mentioned contradiction as one of the comments to Thierry's documenta critique. And personally, I don't think contradictions as such are any problems. I think sometimes it can be even an honest way of showing that there are existing contradictions. So that's not the problem. And opacity in itself, to be able to keep on not changing or not being flexible to the change, and as you say, something that we don't have to understand and so on. That's not either a problem. And to be all times in the same time and look vertically is not the problem either. But I think that there is a fear of, there is a risk of misusage. And this is my question to you. So if you promote opacity as a way of curating, don't you think that it might be misused in many ways? So if you make a big show like Documenta, which is an icon, it's a symbol of what we all should think within the contemporary art world from now and then 5 next years, don't you think there is a risk of misusage? So if we talk about things and we don't insist on being precise and we don't insist on being making statements and we have this openness and all times in all time and opacity and so on, don't you think there is a risk of this being misused in a way so we benefit some other things like market or power and so on? Because we are creating a stage where there is a message of being critique and being reflective, but there is no critique and no reflection. So the contemporaneity being a fiction, yes, you say that, but maybe people who are actually going to document it, they don't know that what they are seeing is a fiction.
Yeah, well, so the first point is it a risk? Yes, it is. And it's a risk worth taking, in my opinion. Life is a risk. There's no one answer to anything. What I'm suggesting, in a very modest and speculative way, is that the question of opacity in the way that Glissant raises it within a power relation between the West and the non-West, right? That's how it's not just a kind of a concept that comes out of post-structuralist philosophy. It comes out of thinking about power relations between the West and the non-West, right? And the demand for the constant demand for transparency from the West. What he's saying is, let's take a step back from that, and to reconsider that, right? And to think about how the right to not understand everything, the right to not interpret everything, can actually open up a new window, a new door that some people can go through, not everyone. So there is a risk that some people won't understand that.
Do you hear me? Yeah. It's not about the risk if people understand it or not. It's about the risk for misusing it. So
By
that
the curator, you mean?
Yeah, and then the next question is, who is benefiting out of this?
Yeah.
Is
Well,
it the power, the money?
That depends. I think it depends on how the logistics, on how the project is curated. So, for example, in some of the models of curating that I'm interested in, it's not something which just comes from the curator. It's a collaborative process from the beginning with artists and with other thinkers, with a wide range of agents. So it's not. So in that sense, the ethical dangers of that ethical risks are spread and distributed, rather than, as you say, it being the kind of centralized curatorial mysteries of power. So that's slightly offset in a way, in my opinion, by a more collaborative form of dialogical curating, which I think is much more interesting. And in a way, we might even move away from the idea of curating, right? And that's why I mentioned moving towards research, curatorial and artistic research. That's really, in the project that I was working on, that's what we're trying to do, is move away from the idea of curating as this kind of power thing, all these fantastic, well-known curators doing this, and moving more towards thinking about what does art, right, and staging art and presenting art, what does it mean in the world? And how can it help us to understand, or sometimes not understand, the mysteries and the opportunities, in our current existence? That's kind of what I'm trying to think of. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's how I would to frame that.
Which is quite interesting, because I've seen that's another question here, but it's quite interesting because this hour, today, our colleagues from the stage world, from the theatre world, are meeting in Malmö at a huge conference, trying to look into the future there. And one of the things that they're discussing is, can we still talk about programming in the sense that we've always been talking about programming theatre basically raising the same questions as you do,
Yeah.
saying our whole terminology is wrong because it doesn't allow us to rethink who's doing what with whom and when. So we have to try to find out what are the components. Maybe it's completely new DNA we are actually seeking after, and we don't know what to do about it. And in that process, yes, there will be use and misuse. There will be a lot of friction baked into it. We have a last question coming from Peter. Yes.
Yes. Peter Benstead. I'm a cultural producer working with young and emerging artists on the edge here in Denmark. And I wanted to tell an everyday story, which is posed as a question maybe, and it's about the where and the with who. Because you've talked, Paul, a lot about the galleries and the big institutions. Yeah. I was out yesterday afternoon with 3 young emerging artists, very young, with background in Syria and Iraq, and we were out in a very rundown housing estate where they were researching locations for a performance they're going to make next Saturday. And I was just, there was a point at which they were looking for a location where they needed a balcony. Now, where do you find most balconies? That's in housing estates. And they were looking and looking and looking, and the Syrian girl, Asil, she grabbed a grandmother who was out walking, and she said, do you know anybody who lives up here? And she said, yeah, my daughter lives up there. So we shouted up to the balcony, and the 3 women came to and 2 daughters came to the balcony, and they shouted down, they exchanged information about what they were doing, and they created a new location. They created a balcony in the housing estate for a performance that's happening next week. So my question really is, this for me was a great artistic moment. This was where art was being created. This was not just contemporary or post-contemporary. This was just art in the everyday. And for me, my question is this where art really is? Out with the people, out where you're just working with people in an artistic situation, creating things which are everyday.
The answer to that is absolutely, yes, absolutely. I mean, you know, let's be clear. The art did not start with the art world. It will not end with the art world. There's a world outside of the art world, which is what I talked about, the space of culture, right? What I'm trying to do, as someone that's positioned within the art world in some ways, and we're all positioned both in and out, is to think of that boundary and how we bring the two into dialogue. How we bring the kind of work that you're talking about into dialogue with the huge resources, ideas, problematics within contemporary art. Maybe that may not be a fruitful dialogue, but I completely agree with you that, yes, of course it's art. And I think, you know, we need to what your comment does is to remind us that, number one, we need to be humble about what art is. Number 2 is recognize that we don't own and control art, that the people do, right? And people outside of the museums and, you know, this hall do. But I think the challenge now is to think about where we as curators, cultural producers, artists, position ourselves in relation to the real world.
I think that's a very, very fine closing comment. Paul Goodwin, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Cheers.